Hi guys, so before we get into it, a very quick disclaimer that you'll find all my other Hammer reviews in my Hammer playlist, and there will be mild spoilers today, but I'm not going to tell you who the killer is because you don't find out until quite late in the film, and I think if you knew it would reduce your enjoyment of the movie somewhat. Plus, it's very easy for me to think that this is one of the lesser seen Hammer films somehow. I'm just guessing on that. So this is a Jimmy Sangster helmed Hammer film. He directed 3 in total for Hammer. So he did The Horror of Frankenstein in 1970, he did Lust for a Vampire in 71, and then he did this. And I would suggest that this is just about his best of the 3 films, which might be a little bit controversial because I know Lust for a Vampire has a lot of fans, but this is a really interesting one. It's about a young woman called Peggy who, at the start of the story, is recovering from a nervous breakdown, but luckily she has a really nice fiancé who lives in Hertfordshire. He's a school teacher at high school, and he has a nice cottage that's actually on the grounds of the school, weirdly, but it works for this movie. But the night before Peggy is due to go off and join her fiancé in Hertfordshire, somebody breaks into her apartment, grabs her around the neck, knocks her unconscious but doesn't kill her, which is kind of weird. So then she goes off to live with her fiancé, but no sooner has she settled herself in, the same thing happens again. Somebody breaks into the cottage this time, grabs Peggy round the neck, knocks her unconscious but doesn't kill her. What the hell is going on? And it turns out, as we get down the final stretch of the story, a devious plot is revealed, people will die, but I'm not going to tell you any of that stuff. I'll let you discover it for yourself. But if you're like me, you might find it kind of easy to guess who the killer is in this, actually. I guessed quite early on, and I think there are 2 reasons for that. Firstly, I've seen a lot of films that are written by Jimmy Sangster. I feel like I kind of know the man's mind by this point. Secondly, there are only 4 main characters in this film, and one of those is the protagonist. So it's not a long list of suspects that are dangled under your nose. Your brain will consider all of the people available, and I reckon there's a good chance you'll come to the same conclusion that I did very early on, but it didn't ruin my enjoyment of the movie or anything. Of the 4 main actors in this, only one I didn't recognise, which would be Judy Geeson, who plays Peggy. But looking at her filmography, she went on to have a very distinguished career in movies and TV, and in recent years she's actually been in a couple of Rob Zombie films, presumably as a much older actress. I wouldn't have recognised her in those films. I've not even seen one of them, to be fair, Lords of Salem. Peter Cushing is a much more recognisable actor in this. He plays the headmaster, a dry old stick is how this character describes himself in the script, and I would absolutely agree with that. Ralph Bates plays the fiancé of Peggy. I'm guessing that Bates and Sangster were quite tight back in the day because Ralph Bates had leading roles, or at least a main role, in all 3 of the films that Sangster directed for Hammer, and that just leaves us with Joan Collins, who plays the headmaster's wife. Now, there was more than a 20-year age gap between Peter Cushing and Joan Collins, but it doesn't really matter in this film. Firstly, they're not really on screen at any point, not as far as I can remember anyway. Secondly, the headmaster character is a very wealthy man. He owns the high school and he owns the grounds all around it. He's got a lot of money at his disposal, so you could put this relationship down to a kind of gold diggery type thing if you choose. I didn't recognise Joan Collins when she first came on in this film, because this character that she's playing looks in her 20s, but I looked up Joan Collins' age at the time that this would have been filmed, and she was actually close to 40, so already at this stage of her career she was doing a very, very good job of looking a lot younger than she actually was. This film is something of a slow burn, I will warn you. It will feel for a long time like not much is happening. But I didn't mind that because I was always engrossed by this from minute one. There's a really good atmosphere to the film. A lot of the locations are really cool in this. The cottage, maybe not so much. That's just your run-of-the-mill house masquerading as a cottage. But the high school looks really cool, both from the outside and on the inside. From the outside, it's got this Tudor style, I guess, the sort of thing you might see if you wander through York Town Centre on a Saturday afternoon. On the inside, all the rooms are really spacious, and because there's no kids around, supposedly this is the middle of the summer or something, that just adds to the atmosphere. It just feels really hollow and slightly unsettling. Peggy spends a lot of time in this just wandering the corridors and going upstairs and looking inside various rooms, gymnasiums, this or that room. And it's kind of creepy that there's nobody else around. The headmaster himself is a very creepy character. When the headmaster meets Peggy for the first time in this, they have a really weird conversation. At first, it seems like the headmaster's just a normal guy, but then they go into this room where there's all these knots on the wall. You know how in like Scouts and Cubs in the UK, kids will make different types of knots with ropes, and then they'll get a badge that they can slap on their shirt. Well, there's a wall in this one room that's full of different knots, and the headmaster turns to Peggy and says, "I really like knots. Do you like knots?" It's just the most creepy comment. But it's not just a one-off. Like, the very next thing he says after that is, so he comments on her hair. He says, "Oh, you've got really nice hair. Do you want to take your headband off so I can have a better look at it?" And then he says, "Do this favour for an old man, wouldn't you?" And it's just really obnoxious. But the way Peter Cushing's saying it, he might not actually mean it in that kind of pervy way, because back when this film came out, it was an era where older people might say stuff like that and it would be noticed less. You know, like teenagers and younger adults, in those times you wouldn't necessarily say anything if you heard obviously creepy comments like that. I'm just drawing on my own experience from growing up in the 80s. Adults said weird stuff like that. You wouldn't really question it. You'd just kind of think, I'll just let that go. That was a bit weird, but I'll let that go. But maybe kids and young adults today, they would call out stuff like that and would not be too pleased about it. I mean, could you imagine in 2024 having a movie where a guy like Peter Cushing would say, "So, do you like knots? Do you like tying?" It'd just be like, that would be called out straight away, to be fair. But this scene, it just highlights not just the fact that we're watching a film in a bygone era, but also the fact that Peggy's character is really timid. She's not likely to speak up against stuff like that if she can help it. There's another scene that's a good example of this. So she's out wandering the grounds at one point, and then Joan Collins' character, I can't remember her name. Have I ever done one of these reviews where I've been able to remember all of the character names? Probably not. But in terms of Joan Collins, we'll just call her Joan Collins for ease of reference. So Peggy somehow ends up stood next to a rabbit. I don't know how she accomplishes this, because every time I've got anywhere near a rabbit, it's always run off. But whatever. Judy Geeson's probably just more appealing to rabbits than me, probably. But she ends up stood next to a rabbit, and then Joan Collins from somewhere fires a shotgun that just obliterates the rabbit. It's a really shocking moment, because the film's been really quiet up to this point, and it's like, holy shit, they just blew apart a rabbit. But then Collins comes out of the shrubbery, wherever she's been hiding, and you think to yourself, okay, well, Peggy's going to be really mad at Joan Collins now. But it's actually the other way around. Joan Collins is mad at Peggy. She's like, "What are you doing? Wandering around a field? You could have been shot." I'm thinking, no, Peggy's got to be mad at Joan Collins. You know, how can you aim a shotgun at a rabbit and not notice a human being stood like literally inches from the rabbit? It just could not happen. But the scene only demonstrates again that Peggy is a really timid, shy sort of character. Around her fiancé, not so much, but when she's dealing with strangers or people she's not so sure about, she doesn't quite have that strong, independent, confident feel that, say, more modern final girls have. And I think that's one thing that have improved in modern horror films. You do get a lot of final girls now who are more confident and speak up for themselves, and who will fight back against stupid characters like Joan Collins. There's an interesting conceit in this whereby Peggy starts hearing distant child voices coming from some classroom across the other side of the school. But when she investigates the room in question, she finds it empty. There's nobody in there. And I guess we're left wondering as a viewer, okay, is this something supernatural that's going on? Or is Peggy hearing voices? She has had a nervous breakdown recently, after all. But then a third possibility rears its head, because a couple of scenes later, Peggy asks the headmaster if he ever tapes classroom activity so he can play the noise back during the summer, just to make the school feel a bit less silent. So we're left with all these possibilities as to what's caused the distant child voices. Now, this was a very spooky scene when it first happened, but it also leads to a really cool payoff later in the movie during the film's big chase sequence, I guess. And then there's a second payoff for it later on as well. So this idea is very much the backbone of the film, really. It's the one really brilliant idea in the script that stands out. In terms of performances, I'm always tempted to go straight to Peter Cushing when it comes to this column, but he's not actually in this movie that much. I don't know if it was a case of, yes, I'll be in it. I mean, you'll only have me for 1 week because I'm a busy man, or whether his character really just wasn't needed that much for this. Joan Collins isn't in the film that much either. She's clearly having fun being a complete bitch, but she's not in that many scenes. It's mainly the Judy Geeson and Ralph Bates show on the whole. They do very well with their roles. I'm trying to think of some negatives just for a little bit of balance. The only thing that I could point to about this movie that I didn't really like, and I go back to this idea of somebody grabbing somebody from behind without being seen, knocking them out, and this after they've broken into their house without alerting anybody. It doesn't really ring true for me, especially given that it happens twice in this movie to the same person in completely different counties. I mean, and the second time around, Peggy would be on her guard. She'd make sure the doors were locked and the windows were bolted. She'd probably have 2 guard dogs by the front door. I just don't see it happening to her twice in a row exactly like this. I don't see this person who's breaking in being able to achieve this. And this is the problem a little bit with Jimmy Sangster's writing sometimes. He does go a little bit theoretical. He comes up with stuff that probably looks good on paper, but it doesn't feel that realistic when you're watching the movie. It's not too bad in this. I mean, I got over the fact that I didn't like this concept very, very quickly, and I really enjoyed the rest of the movie. But if you've ever seen a film like Nightmare from 1964, which was also written by Sangster, that entire movie just feels like one big theoretical model of something that would never happen. The scheme in that film that the villains come up with, it utterly ludicrous. They'd never managed to get away with that. They'd never even try that in the first place. But in this movie, it wasn't too bad. On the whole, I really enjoyed this, I've got to say. I said earlier that I marginally prefer this to Lust with a Vampire and Horror of Frankenstein. Now that I've talked about the movie for a fair bit, I might go a bit further than that and say that I like this movie a lot more than those other 2 films, which is high praise, I think, because I do like those other 2 films. So before we wrap up, I'll quickly show you the version of the film that I've got for this. Here is my Blu-ray copy of Fear in the Night, and it looks fantastic on this disc. This movie is really good visually, not just the incredible design of the schoolhouse, but the whole thing. I just remember thinking when I was watching it, wow, this film looks terrific. And I can't even put my finger on it. Like scenes that shouldn't look amazing, like when Peggy and her fiancé just walk out of this dirty-looking concrete shopping mall. Somehow the scene looks fantastic all the way through this. I was just really, really impressed with the visuals, the sound of the film. Fantastic. In terms of features, there's not a commentary, sadly, on this. I would have loved a commentary track for this. There is a featurette, which I've not seen, called End of Term Inside Fear in the Night. And there's also a trailer. And I think it's just about time for the Bag of Terror. So let's see how I'm going to score this. We've got 1, 2, 3... 4 bloody axes out of 5. I would say that this is one of Hammer's best thriller type movies, if you like. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Definitely going in my Hammer rewatch pile. And that is all for today. I'll be back soon to do another Hammer review. I think my next one is going to be Satanic Rites of Dracula. So until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.